It's really a pleasure to be here. It's always fun coming to someone else's class rather than your own. You can come, you can speak, you can leave. I don't have to evaluate you or take your attendance or anything like that. So I'm on sabbatical leave this semester from my home institution and have spent the last 2.5 weeks here at Foreman Christian, where I've been before. I was here last March, almost a year ago, just for about 2-3 days doing a workshop in conjunction with some of the other universities. This trip is coming to an end, unfortunately, but hopefully I'll be back. Maybe I'll see you in another classroom at some point in the next year, which would be really wonderful for me. So the journey started in the Middle East. We're always trying to figure out what the Middle East is or where the Middle East is. It started in Bahrain. From there we moved to Kuwait. Spent a month in Egypt, where I've been going for many decades. This was the longest trip that I've had there in a while. It was nice to touch base, although very interesting in many ways. Now here, and then next week in Abu Dhabi, then back to the States to figure out what to do with the rest of this semester of freedom, some of which I need to start writing, but I'll see what's that. So I want this to be really informal. I know this is an introductory level class, so you perhaps haven't had so much background yet. Your semester just started a few weeks ago. I'll stand because I'm stiff, because I was at Gaddafi Stadium last night. The cricket was wonderful. The seats are not so wonderful. If you're a Qalander fan, I'm sorry. They look terrible. I saw them play last year about this time, and they lost also, but they obviously went on to win and look much better. I don't know what's wrong. One of the things I think about as I've become a cricket fan, T20 is in some ways close to baseball, our sport. There are very many differences that lead to those kinds of origins, but the sort of compact 3-hour version of cricket versus the longer versions, and particularly the test matches, are very foreign. And foreign to most people in the United States, although there will be a T20 tournament, I guess, this summer for the first time in big stadiums with ticket prices that are too high. But I'm always asking the question, why cricket appeared as a colonial product and then a post-colonial product in certain parts of the British Empire and didn't appear in other parts. There's very little, if any, cricket in the Arab Middle East. They now play in the Gulf, as you well know, but most of those populations are not, let's call it, indigenous Arab. They tend to be from the broader South Asian community. There's a little bit of cricket actually in Israel, but again amongst populations of South Asian, particularly South Indian, Jewish origin, and how they picked it up after having been in the country for several generations is also kind of interesting. The Palestinian population was into football, soccer, as we call it in the States. So I'm really curious. Egypt has no cricket. Kenya, as far as I know, maybe they're starting, has no cricket. But other parts of the British Empire picked it up, and of course you're crazy for it. We're much more, learning about football. So I had an interesting football experience over the course of the past couple of years. You followed the World Cup a few years ago. Controversial in some respects, because much of the writing about the World Cup was as the stadiums were being built. There was a lot of talk at that point in time about citizenship in the Gulf and all of the Gulf states, the fact that they rely so much upon guest labor, forced labor, the conditions under which the workers were mobilized to build stadiums. And I was in Doha afterwards and saw a couple of those stadiums from the outside, and they're spectacularly beautiful. But there was a human cost. There was a lot of talk about what it would mean in a state like Doha, which is becoming a kind of hub for transit. Most people don't leave the airport. What happens when people leave and move out into society? There was, talk about human rights. There was a talk about gender rights, transgender, gay rights, things like that. It was an interesting kind of thing. But then the football itself. So we were in Oman at the opening of the World Cup. And what was the most stunning game in the first round? Who remembers? In football. The Saudis beat who? Argentina, remember?
Yeah.
So all of the Omanis, and Oman doesn't have a team that's worth rooting for, I suppose, at least at that level. They never make it. So all of the Omanis were Argentine fans, because that's easy. And then the Saudis beat the Argentinians, and suddenly the Omanis felt guilty. Like we should have been rooting for our Arab brothers, whatever the relationship is between, Saudi Arabia is one of the big powerhouses, and with all of the, political and social and religious discourse that's been going on. But they were our brothers, and we didn't root against them, but we just didn't assume that they would win. And so all of our attention was on the Argentinians, and suddenly the Argentinians lost. And so there was confusion, a little bit of guilt. Then there was a little bit of confusion as well afterwards, with the Iranian team, because Iran was the great enemy, of course. Unfortunately, the way geopolitics have worked out over the course of the last decade or so. So no one wanted to root for the Iranians, but then there was this question. Iran was going through turmoil for the past year and a half. There was a movement called the Women Life Freedom Movement, after a young woman was brutalized by the police for having her hijab not in proper order. This is something that in Iran has been vacillating over the years, and she may have been, provocative according to social standards. She may also just have not known that there was a little bit of a crackdown. She was brutally beaten and died shortly thereafter. This movement appeared. And the Iranian national team was not sure where they fit in on that. They were Iranian citizens. They had to go back to them. But they garnered a certain amount of support because following this tradition which has emerged in the United States, they adopted a particular posture when the Iranian national anthem was being played. And then suddenly got a lot of support for the team, if not for the country that they represented. And that includes in the Arab world and in the Sunni Arab world, which has been, taught to believe that there's this terrible, long-standing, all-time rift between those countries. It's gotten complicated in the last year or so with the Yemenis becoming involved in the Palestine conflict and the like. But that was also a moment of confusion. Then finally, as things played themselves out, we had the Moroccans emerge as part of what in the States we call the Final Four. They didn't make it all the way, but suddenly there was a lot of support for Morocco. They were being hailed as Arab champions. They were being hailed as African champions. And then the irony is that most of the people on the Moroccan team weren't born in Morocco. Their parents weren't living in Morocco. They tended to be French or Spanish citizens. So in a sense, they're part of this new Europe. But the Moroccans also didn't know what to do. The team didn't know what to do with all of that. Because Morocco is wrought by division. Cultural division. It hasn't led to violence, but it's led to various periods of opening and closing amongst that population that considers itself indigenous. We call them Berbers, they call themselves Amazigh. These are divisions which were accentuated and are exacerbated by the colonial powers. The French deciding who was Arab and who was Indigene, which meant Berber. And so generations grew up with these kind of divisions impacting upon it. And that was colonial divide and rule. We see it throughout the Arab world, we see it in South Asia, we see it throughout Africa as well. And so the Moroccan team being championed as the hero of the Arabs. There is no Middle East Cup, right? So Egypt plays in the African Cup, and Jordan and some of the other countries play in the Asian Cup. The Moroccans created a really interesting discussion within Morocco and about Morocco. And yet they were embraced because they were the last remaining team that came from, we might call it the global south. So the Africans did embrace them, the Arabs did embrace them, but they had a lot to talk about as to who and what they are. And these are some of the issues that we still try and focus on and try and study, particularly in those parts of this area that we call the Middle East, where its remains. Well, we still have, when I talk to people, I say there are still 3 remaining issues that weren't solved after World War I and then were further exacerbated after World War II. One is near here, Kashmir. The other is the situation of the Kurds within Iraq, within much of eastern Anatolia, Turkey, and partly in Iran as well. And the other one, of course, is the question of Palestine. One of the interesting things about Doha was the way in which Palestinian flags were flown by fans, even though there was no Palestine team, particularly when the Moroccans played. This is an issue that the Moroccans are concerned about, but they also have their own things their own issues to think about. But it was a place, because it was an Arab country, that one could fly that flag and not be arrested, not be beaten. You can fly that flag in the rest of the Arab world now, but to be able to do it on an international stage with so many people watching, and so many said, was actually one of the most positive, non-controversial expressions of Palestinian identity, when in history, we know that so often Palestinian identity has been asserted through violence. We've argued about it, we've talked about it, we've been living with that through particularly tight lenses since last October, when Hamas, stunning attack, breaking through Israeli defenses, killing more people than have been killed in any kind of cross-border raid ever, and grabbing hostages. It's an incredible breakdown of Israeli security. It's something that the Israelis are trying to avoid talking about as they continue this aggressive war, genocidal war, upon the population of Gaza. But once that ends, once there's a ceasefire that holds, eventually there has to be, the Israelis will have to reckon with how they were caught asleep, or whether they weren't asleep, but thought that whatever was being planned by Hamas was something that they could handle. They obviously couldn't. And I suspect that as we find out what went on, we still don't know why or what the ultimate goal is. People keep asking me, what do you think they were after? I think to a certain extent, those who crossed the border were confronted by the fact that there was no objection to their being there. There was no defense. And so the game plan, probably, we can call it a game plan, probably, just sort of unfolded on the spot. Because the Israeli army was nowhere to be seen. Their missile defense was irrelevant against an attack that had nothing to do with missiles. And their security fence proved to be as porous as beyond expectations. These are things that people will need to think about in many ways. It's very hard to talk about this in some places, particularly in my country right now. As passions have been so inflamed, to talk on a rational level about what a militant organization like Hamas, why they did it, when they did it, what they perhaps were up to, and then all the complexities of the fact that we know that the Israeli government is pouring a lot of money into Gaza to try to pacify the more radical impulses. Israeli policy for all these years has been to try and sidestep the one issue that they must confront, which is Palestine. And one of the things that they were hoping to do, hand in hand with the prior American administration, was to again marginalize that population by establishing normal relations with as many Arab states as they could. Morocco first, and in particular the Gulf states, which seemed to be willing to establish based on economics, and the Saudis slowly moving in that direction. I think that's over for now. Whether it will be resumed within the next few years is something else to think about. So these are all things to think about. Again, you're at the beginning of all of this. When I teach Palestine, and I do two courses, one is a history of Israel and Palestine in modern times, and the other is a history of Palestine until 1948, sort of pivotal year. The one thing that I tell audiences, that I tell students, is that we always need to ask ourselves, in this particular case, what makes Palestine different and what makes Palestine just like all the other parts of the region? And of course, what makes it just like all the other parts of the region is that it was another subsector of a huge empire which was on the verge of collapsing, the Ottoman Empire, one of the great world empires. And as the Ottoman Empire collapsed under the pressures of economic imperialism and then direct imperialism, and then as the Ottomans made a fateful decision in 1914 to side with the side that ultimately lost the First World War. It was a logical decision at the time. Many mistakes were made on all sides, but that's reading things in hindsight. Palestine was carved out as a territory. It was argued over by the Europeans as to what its borders would be. It was crunched in, and the British ultimately took it because it suited British imperial interests and set about creating an intelligentsia and then destroying a political elite that would not work with it, and putting in place, just like one of the great trivia questions is when the first Iraqi king was crowned, what did they play as the crown was put on his head? You want to guess? They played God Save the King. They had no anthem. They had no symbols. He was an imported figure from Arabia who had worked with them. He had been promised Syria as a kingdom, but when the French objected, he'd been driven out of Syria. And so then he was given a kingdom of Iraq. Phony elections were held because there was a huge voting bloc in the southern part of Iraq that would have voted against him. And so the British government created, as they did elsewhere, a kind of machinery for rigged elections, and then put their man on the throne. And his family lasted on the throne from the 1920s until the late 1950s, when they were finally overthrown. And Iraq has been in a different kind of chaos ever since that ultimately produced Saddam Hussein in the late 1960s, that ultimately led to the American-British invasion of 2003, that ultimately led to a state which has been in many ways divided in three and is still trying to find itself. So Palestine is the same story in many ways, but it's different for a couple of reasons, two reasons primarily. One is the proprietary nature that a place we'll call the West placed upon it as being the Holy Land. For Judaism, particularly Christianity, as being the sort of center of what Westerners were defining as something called Western civilization. Western civilization is an idea, just like race is an idea. Ethnicity is an idea. These terms come about at particular points in history. We can write them back in history, but we always need to remember when these terms were first established and became widespread. Western civilization was invented as a course in the United States in the late 19th century. Columbia University came up with the idea of Western civilization, starting in Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley, working its way through to Greece, to Rome, to Europe, to the United States, and to a West which ultimately was the pinnacle of history, which led some scholars to write, particularly one scholar in particular. He didn't mean it except in a kind of provocative way. When the Soviet Union felt, he wrote about the end of history. His argument was we need to start thinking through new lenses. But for those of us who grew up with Western civilization, I never studied your part of the world. I never studied East Asia. I knew nothing about it. I vaguely knew about Mughals and vaguely knew about Maharajas and the Ming Dynasty and Qing Dynasty and things we'd see at the museum. But we learned Western civilization. And Palestine, of course, was an extremely important part of that. As was, one might say, the whole Middle East, but especially Palestine, what the British came to call Palestine. It was, if I want to speak as a Westerner, it was ours. As was the entire Islamic, let's say, Middle East. These were places that were familiar, even if they were imagined through Bible class and things like that. So that made this part of the world really important for people. Not necessarily because, as some of them believed, that there would be an end of times that needed certain steps taken, but because this was the place where the prophets walked. This was the place where particularly Jesus walked. Even our great author, Mark Twain, who was an incredible cynic, and particularly about religion, when he did his grand tour, which he wrote about in a book called Innocents Abroad, devastating critique in many ways, tongue-in-cheek satirical about Americans and our sense of what old is and our relationship with worlds that are much older than us. When he got to Jerusalem, he paused a little bit. He had his jokes to tell, but he said, this is a place where something happened that changed history. And people would have marked the spots where it took place. If you go to Jerusalem, you'll find different sites according to different Christian denominations as to where certain things happened. But not in particular, the site of where the old temple was and where Jesus carried the cross. These moments that are historical but quasi-historical, because we only have certain points about them. The other thing that makes Palestine unique, of course, is that it became the site of a particular colonial venture. And the Jewish nationalists, they created a movement they called Zionists. They talked about it in colonial terms. It makes people uncomfortable sometimes because they want to say, well, it was different. And it was different because they weren't coming with the flag of a particular country the way colonialists came to Kenya or to India or to Algeria or places like that. But it was a movement to settle from Europe at a point in time when nationalism, again, a new idea, was on the rise, and when a particular population in Europe, not all certainly, but a segment of that population, came to define themselves as a national body, potentially national body, rather than simply a religious community. And many of them were not terribly religious or were hostile to religion. As an ideology that they saw as holding progress back, keeping people in. And the same issues that we find in the Muslim world, in the Christian world, in the Hindu world as well. But that made Palestine unique. And so as 1914 led to the end of the First World War, and the Europeans carved the Arab world up into states and protectorates and places like that, Palestine became this place where there were two competing groups. Outsiders who came in who had national aspirations, locals who were also beginning to feel a kind of national movement. This is a period in which Arabs were defining themselves as Arabs and finding that they had a kind of common symmetry that didn't have anything to do with religion. As we sort of explained to students in the States who don't quite recognize what all of this is that an Arab Christian, an Arab Muslim, an Arab Jew would look at themselves and say, we're all Arabs. We have a common heritage. It's rooted in our language. It's rooted in our history. Islam is an important expression of our Arabness, but we're Arabs, and that makes us different from Turks or Kurds or others. A kind of broad ethno-identity half a century before the word ethnic was invented. And then what made that more complicated was the fact that, and this was driven in large part by the fact that the Europeans had drawn fences around them, the idea then of a national identity. Can I be an Arab nationalist, but suddenly I'm an Iraqi citizen, or a Jordanian citizen, or an Egyptian citizen? And some places are more diverse in terms of the divisions that need to be breached. And some places less so. Egypt is a place, partly because of its geography, the Nile Valley, where Egyptians feel they're all Egyptians. They make fun of each other. Rural Egyptians are made fun of by urban Egyptians. Upper southern Egyptians are made fun of by northern Egyptians in particular. The same kind of jokes and parallels that we see in so many places. Wherever I go in a country, I always ask what group is made fun of and what accent is made fun of. And teaching in the American South as a northerner, I find myself planted in a place like that because I grew up with terrible images of the American South, many of which were valid. A place of, official segregation, but also a place where certain accents were, were always used when people were seen as being slow or worse, things like that. So I've just come from Egypt. Egypt is the place where I planted myself many years ago, partly because when Americans went to study Arabic, they usually went either to Egypt or to Lebanon, and Lebanon was off limits at that point in time. Lebanon was in the 1970s, and then in the 80s and into the 90s was hell on earth. It was the place that became Rwanda, that became, Bosnia, that became other places. So I planted myself in Egypt. I've grown increasingly attached to Egypt. My Arabic, which was formal Arabic as I was learning it in the States, became Egyptian Arabic, which is really helpful, at least was for many years as I traveled in the Arab world, because Egypt was the nerve center, was the Hollywood of the Middle East. Both for films as well as for television, and even a place where many of the biggest stars went to record and became kind of Egyptianized in many ways. So I can walk the streets in rural Morocco where I don't understand the Arabic at all and plead for some French or plead for some formal Arabic. I can walk the streets in Kuwait, places like that, and speak my Egyptian dialect, and everyone understands it. They smile. They sort of figure, you don't look quite like an Egyptian. Maybe you're Palestinian or Syrian or something because of complexion, but I can use it. Egypt is a place to think about. It was the leader of the Arab world. We'll get there in many ways, particularly in the 1950s, 1960s, into the 1970s. It struggles to be the leader of the Arab world. It's right now one of those states that is only surviving on outside funding. If the Emiratis, if the Saudis, this is even more than, I'm not sure to what extent the Chinese are there, but they're knocking on everyone's doors in many ways, and making the United States, and even to a certain extent the Europeans, increasingly irrelevant. If the Czechs stopped coming from the Gulf, Egypt would collapse. Because its economy is, I don't know, it's hard. My dollar is strong, just like it's strong here. It's hard to sort of touch what you guys are living in many ways, except for the fact that, after all my travels, I have to get used to the fact that, 100 rupees, is not so much anymore. It used to be. I don't think, are there even paisa anymore? And likewise in Egypt, when I first started going, you could not get change for a 10-pound note, and now 10 pounds is like 100 rupees in many ways. It's a country which had a brief moment, which I hope you guys have a chance to talk about, in 2010, 2011, 2012, when Egyptians finally got tired of a political system which in many ways had been celebrated. I'll go to Dr. Sikandar Hayat's class later this afternoon and talk in particular about Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was one of the great. He defined the generation of the 50s and 60s and then came crashing down in many ways with the defeat to the Israelis in 1967. But in 2010, it started in Tunisia, and I don't think we still know why. A young Tunisian shopping cart wala who had been applying for a permit over and over and over again, not college bound, he simply wanted to sell sabzi from his cart, and he was denied a permit and humiliated over and over. And in particular, the story goes, finally when he went to the local office to get his permit, slapped by a woman. He set himself on fire. He didn't die immediately. He died in hospital a few days later. The president of Tunisia, Ben Ali, went to see him. It was supposed to be a public relations venture, and it was a disaster. Some rappers used Ben Ali in subsequent songs as things were unfolding to kind of capture the hatred and fear that people had for him. Many Europeans would go as tourists to Tunisia, and they had no sense of what was really going on in the country. But the country exploded, and suddenly the pictures came down. And I showed people a photo that a Tunisian colleague gave me of Ben Ali's picture on a garbage dump, one of those official pictures from a government office. Really powerful. And then it spread to Egypt, and people went to this downtown Tahrir Square, and they stayed from late 2010 till about February of 2011, chanting finally go, 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 in Arabic, irhab, leave, to a president who'd been in power for 30 years, who started off as a reform figure, but then cemented himself, and then pitched himself to the West as, without me, there will be total chaos. And suddenly there was total chaos. Although it appeared to be organized in many ways. Spontaneously, people in Cairo Square worked together to keep it clean. They worked together to bring medical supplies in. And in particular, when the army and the regime decided to try and chase them out on one or two occasions, they held off horse and camel drivers who were beating them with sticks and the like. And finally, Mubarak went. We're still trying to figure out when. It'll take a long time to be able to put together the picture. But in retrospect, the army, which runs the state, decided that he was expendable, and decided that they didn't want the alternative that he was preparing for, which was his son, who would come to the States as a kind of liberal business capitalist and the like. But Egyptians, I always had a feeling, and I don't claim I saw anything coming. I was more and more depressed about the situation. But Egyptians weren't going to tolerate Hosni Mubarak's son as their leader, even though constitutionally it was already in place. I once asked one of the one of the justices of the Egyptian Supreme Court, who I met, can it be stopped? And he said, no, we can't. We can't stop it. It's gone through Parliament. So Mubarak went. He was replaced by a military man who quickly went because he simply seemed to be a continuation. And then Egyptians had, for the first time since 1950, 2 years before the military took over in 1952, they had the first free elections in the country's history. And Egyptians were faced with a tricky choice. They had three candidates. One reflected the sort of progressive state social ideas of Nasser. You'll talk about that in class, I hope. One represented the old current regime. These were people that Egyptians referred to as al-fulul, the remnants, the leftovers, the scraps of the old regime. The third represented the largest political opposition force in the country, which was the Muslim Brotherhood, a party which had emerged in the late 1920s through the 1930s, a tremendously interesting party, some connection in many ways to Jamaat Islami here, but different in the sense that it was kept even more on the outside. Always wondering whether it should join, trying every once in a while in the 1940s, even in the 1950s, to get back in, and then always having its hands slapped. And so a very hostile attitude towards the political process. But now they ran a candidate, in large part because they could not, and also because younger members were very supportive of trying to move into the political system. So at the end of round one, Egyptians were left with the progressive Nasser-era person was defeated. They were left with the old regime figure, a man associated with the Ministry of Interior, and they were left with the Muslim Brotherhood. Many people have been arguing for years that the system needed to open up. The Brotherhood was an organized opposition with support in the country, largely because they'd never been in power, and they expressed an alternative. Same thing happened in Palestine, by the way, in 2005 or 2006, when Hamas won elections to parliament and took over leadership in many places. It was opposed in the West. Certain institutions like the Jimmy Carter Center in Atlanta, which oversee elections to see if they're prove that they're determined to what extent they're free, argued that these were free elections. And a lot of people went off and voted for Hamas, even though they didn't have the religious agenda of Hamas. They simply wanted to get the old guys, and emphasize guys, out of power and bring in someone new. So Egyptians had that same choice. And in round two of the elections, they elected the Muslim Brotherhood candidate. He wasn't the candidate they really wanted because that candidate had had a law passed which didn't allow him to run. There was a bit of rigging going on, but the electoral process was free. And so Mohamed Morsi became president. he found himself in an impossible situation. We still need to study what happened between his inauguration in 2012 and his overthrow in 2013. And it's a shame in many ways that he wasn't allowed to stay on, or he wasn't dismissed from office according to constitutional procedures. A year later, what happened was people went back to Tahrir Square, calling for his recall, trying to figure out what kind of mechanism there was for it. You've had constitutional issues here regarding things like that, but the recall that took place in Parliament was done under parliamentary guise. The Egyptians didn't quite have that. Another group of people camped out in another square all the way across Cairo, called Rabia al-Adawiya Square, or Rabba in short. Their symbol was this: it's now illegal to do this in Cairo. You can get arrested for raising the arba in Arabic, right? And somehow suddenly things changed over the course of a couple of days when the group in Tahrir Square, the masses in Tahrir Square, calling for the recall of Mohammed Morsi, and many of them had many legitimate grievances against the government. From the outside, it's always easy to say he was in an impossible position and needed time to either succeed or fail. But that crowd changed, and over the course of a couple of days, instead of calling for his recall, they wanted a reassertion of the military, and that's what they got. The army flew over the square, dropped flowers, purple and red colors, the colors of the Egyptian flag, and then they cracked down on the crowd in Rabia al-Adawiya Square, and ultimately there was a massacre a month and a half later. We're still not sure how many people were killed. And it's been the army ever since, in a far more direct way than it had been under Mubarak, far more authoritarian than it had been under Mubarak. So they have Abdel Fattah Sisi as president. He was Morsi's minister of war. He came from the military. He was the military's choice to run the country. He took his uniform off, but that's kind of a facade. And he's like Mubarak. Every 5 years, he reappoints himself under special emergency provisions. The country will not have elections. And it's almost a state, and I'm sort of trying to think this through, it's almost a state without politics. And where Egyptians are caught right now is that the country is stable. There are 50 to 60,000 people, prisoners of conscience, who have vanished in Egyptian jails, are being treated terribly. President Morsi died under conditions, this is Navalny type conditions. Sometimes they get out, oftentimes they don't. Their families try to, human rights organizations will petition for them and things like that. But the country's really in that kind of grip. At the same time, it's stable. And so when you ask Egyptians, they're very wary if you don't know them, what's going on. They'll tell you life is hard. While we were there, 1 week, the local shawarma place that we used to go to, he apologized profusely to us, said, "I'm sorry, the sandwich that you've been buying is 10 pounds more." Okay. A couple places, the menus vanished because they had to rewrite them with the new prices. They want everybody to use QRC codes anyway since COVID, which I hate. And well, Egyptians will tell you, thank God we're not Libya. Or thank God we're not, it's a long list. Thank God we're not Lebanon. Thank God we're not Iraq. Thank God we're not Yemen. Thank God we're not Afghanistan. And I wonder, well, that's the question I want to ask them.
Even Pakistan.
Well, they might be jealous of your political process, because as much as you're critical of it, as much as it still needs to work itself out, there were elections. There was a recall in Parliament. So they might be. That's the question which I didn't have the perhaps courage to ask in many ways. So these are all issues. What places there is politics, what places there is no politics. Your monarchies which are there, your Saudi monarchy. Mohammed bin Salman, believe it or not, is still not king. But he will be at one point. His father is still king. And every ruler of Saudi Arabia since the 1950s has been the son of the single founder. That's family politics in many ways. He'll be a grandson. And of course, he's changing society dramatically. At the same time, he's trying to keep an authoritarian grip, and he's trying to work out the family politics of who he can allow to stay in prison and who he can't. It's a fascinating case, Saudi Arabia. It's punctuated by violence. We had a horrible occurrence of the Saudi-American journalist who was brutally murdered in Istanbul a number of years ago. And women activists who are seeing their agenda fulfilled are finding themselves in prison because they've been too vocal, and there's a fear of what might be unleashed if it doesn't come from the top. But you political structures in different places. A Moroccan king who's trying to hang on. A Libyan state that produced a military ruler, an incredibly interesting person, although volatile and eccentric. The Palestinian situation is incredibly confusing at this point. The Israeli political process is as stuck as anyone else. People who are in opposition of this war that's going on have no outlet at this point. I mean, not to let them off the hook in many ways. And then, of course, the changing global scene. China. We don't talk enough in my country about China as an economic force, because we still see ourselves as the leading economic force. We talk about them as a source of disease. And American labor versus Chinese labor, there's a lot that's changing right now. And hopefully in this class you guys can help put together, the root pieces. I always say wherever we stop, hopefully there's enough foundation so that when something happens in one of the final exam questions I do is I create the name of a country. Sometimes it's called Arabistan or something like that. And I say, there's been a military coup in Arabistan, and this and this and this has happened. What questions do you have? And if you can ask the questions, then the answers can be.
So earlier you were talking about, you said about the Western narrative regarding their history. You said that Westerners believe that Palestine is theirs. And you also said that Mesopotamia, they believe that beginning from Sumerian civilization onwards, they consider this to be part of the Western civilization. Well, I'm a bit confused here because you see, there's another narrative that sees that ancient Greece and Rome is the beginning of Western civilization. So Palestine here has very little in common with, let's say, the classical European history. I think the correlation that you're trying to make with Palestine was more based on religion, Christianity. So here you have two historical Western narratives. One is based on Christianity, which is claiming the entire Islamic Middle East, as you were saying, as theirs, on the basis of Christianity, not on the basis of classical Roman civilization or on the basis of classical...
Let's say on the basis of the monotheistic traditions. Because, for the majority of the Christian tradition, over the last 20 years, certain people have begun to talk about, the Judeo-Christian origins.
This began from Eisenhower's time, when he used the term Judeo-Christian.
It has new, and then of course we have to ask, well, where does Islam fit in?
Political context.
For sure, it always had political
context.
context.
Historically, using Christian thoughts, in good terms, that we see even as early as the Holocaust,
Hitler in Germany. No, you're right. But these were the areas of birth. Civilization was born. And we know that in Jericho are the oldest archaeological remnants of certain transformations from agrarian to urban society. I think Jericho is the oldest city in the world. But this is what produced the sort of monotheism that fused with Greco-Roman. The connections between Greece and Rome and Egypt are, of course, really interesting because they go back and forth. There's a really controversial work 20, 30 years ago called Black Athena, which argued that the Greeks borrowed most of what they had from the Egyptians. And of course we know that Alexander was there, Ptolemaic society. If you go to Egypt and you see the depictions of Greco practice, they adopted a lot from the Egyptians. But it all moved in that direction, and then it never came back. I show students a map of Europe in the 19th century, and all the different proto-kingdoms are in bright colors. And then there's this Ottoman state in gray. The Ottoman Empire was a European empire. Its base was Europe, its population base, its agrarian base, its politics were Eurocentric. The Ottoman Sultan one year would move to Europe, the other year he would move towards Iran. But that's the way these places sort of fell out. So the Ottoman was not considered part of that. Western civilization began in these two river valleys, not the Indus, not any of the Chinese, it was Western civilization. Now we teach world civilization. And that makes it harder because we have more of the globe to cover. So the thing is to try to figure out the thematics of it rather than sort of say, okay, today we're in India, tomorrow we're in China, next week we're in Latin America. Sorry.
Thank you for this insightful talk. I am taking the liberty to ask this question since you have a very good interest in cultural history as well. So, would you like to comment upon the socio-cultural outlook of Egypt? Because I know Egypt because of Kulthum, one of the finest singers ever. So, how would you define the cultural imagination of Egypt?
Egypt sees itself as the capital of Arab culture. Egypt was a place where people left more authoritarian realms in the late 19th century, early 20th century under the Ottomans, and Egypt was the place where capital invested. There are places, just like a strange thing happened in California, just like there was certain capital investment in Bombay, Mumbai, Lahore to a certain extent. So Egypt was the magnet for all of this. And in the proto days of mass media, it's a place where many recordings were made. It's the place where the most powerful radio stations were established that beamed themselves out to the rest of the world. And it's the place where many of the cultural artists found a haven when they couldn't in other places. That's changed over time, particularly with, social media, with digital cameras, with things like that. The Egyptians are fighting to retain their position in many ways. But that's how they saw themselves. So some of the great stars, you're referring to Kulthum, she came from the rural belt of Egypt. But one of the other great singers of the 40s, 50s, 60s, Farid al-Atrash, was a Druze from southern Syria whose family fled because he was part of the ruling elite family that rebelled against the French. Well, he became kind of Egyptian. The Egyptians embraced him, even though he was different. And so many of the early stars of stage, screen, television, also had their origins in a broader Arab world. The big question is, to what extent the Arabs still think of themselves as Arabs, because you'll talk about all the divisions that took place. And one of the moments, we discussed this I think a little bit the other day in private, was when there was this explosion of resentment in 2010, 2011. They called it the Arab Spring, and Arab is important. It happened in Tunisia, it happened in Egypt, it happened without success in Syria and Libya and places like that. But suddenly people in the Arab world, we talk about the Arab street, sometimes that's a little bit contrived, but Arabs began to talk about themselves as Arabs. And then, of course, as things fell apart, the question is to what extent they do now. And I wonder now, with Gaza that's going on, even though people are not as free to speak out in public in many of the states, to what extent they are again thinking about this as an Arab issue, in addition to being the unfinished question of Palestine.
Thank you so much for all the wonderful insight. I have a question from foreign policy perspective that after Abraham Accord, what's the future of Middle East and this ongoing conflict of Israel-Palestine? In our country, the state narrative is the two-state solution for both. So what do you think? What's the possible settlement in context of foreign policy perspective? And my second question, you have a wonderful insight about the monarchy, Middle East, and authoritarian regimes, and Israel is the only democracy. There's a debate within the intellectuals and within the academia that, America, of course, they preach democracy, but when it comes to, practically in the global south, they romance with military and with their authoritarian regimes throughout history. It's unprecedented. Considering the dynamics of Pakistan's politics as well as even in the Middle East, because the monarchy in Saudi that suits Americans' global geostrategic, geopolitical interests, so they're happy. But in other parts of the world, when it comes to Palestine or other countries, like in Iran, if we see, like this, the Islamic Revolution in 1970s and so and so. So this hypocrisy, this duplicity, how do you comment, how could we justify it?
No, their justification is off the table. It just is what it is. The two-state solution is impossible. I mean, it's become a convenient way of trying to talk about things, but the situation on the ground will not allow. We need to see when and if this war and assault on Gaza stops, someone's going to have to rebuild Gaza. The idea of throwing them all out of Gaza, the Egyptians are caught. They don't want to open the gates, partly because it would allow for Gaza to be depopulated. But on the ground, two states doesn't work. So what a radical solution that many Palestinians are calling for, including Israeli citizens, is let's have a one-state solution, and then let's see what democracy produces. Of course, that terrorizes the Israeli state. And where the United States fits in, it's diminishing, but we don't talk about that because it's very hard for us in the States to, most people to recognize it. So it's a real, right now, I think this is a turning point in many ways, the scale of the assault. At the same time, we just celebrated the 3rd year of the Ukraine war, and it almost is not part of our headlines anymore. So how do we keep it in the headlines?
Condemning Ukraine, but sponsoring genocide in Gaza.
Exactly. And it's confusing because for many Americans who normally you would think would support Ukraine against Russia, suddenly Russia has become a friend. And it's a confusing political moment that we have